She walked into the crimson lounge with a manila envelope and the last of her patience. Rain had threaded the city into silver, streetlights blurred into long, patient strokes. The doorman opened the heavy glass, and the jazz inside folded around her like a secret. Marble smelled faintly of lemon wax. Someone at the bar laughed too loudly. Beatrice's heels clicked once on the floor, twice, then steadied. The envelope was warm against her palm, a cheap, stubborn weight that carried 3 years. She had rehearsed this moment in small, brutal fragments, the way she would place the papers, the exact words she would say. She had imagined his face when she slid the manila across the table. Endings could be tidy. Endings could be surgical. She had dug the bones of this marriage out of memory and arranged them on a plate until they made sense. Rodrigo had never liked her in red, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. Tonight, the dress was her armor, and, in a language she had once shared with him, her last attempt to look like someone who could survive without his presence. He was late. She scanned the room like someone scanning a courtroom gallery, cataloging possible witnesses, executives who frequented the lounge, young journalists who mistook celebrity for truth, a woman at the corner table scrolling her phone with the casual cruelty of an audience. The waiter poured a glass of water she did not taste. The jazz brushed at the edges of the exchange she had come to have. When he arrived, he shed rain like a story shedding lies. Rodrigo Andrade moved through the bar with all the practiced ease of a man who had been shaping others' narratives for a living. He apologized with his hands first, palms open, clean, then with his lips. He smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. His hair, which once caught her fingers absent-mindedly during midnight conversations, now had salt at the temples, proof that time, even power, left edges. "You could have texted," she said, and there was a whole archive inside that simple phrase. The unanswered messages, the canceled dinners, the press conferences where his silence had been louder than accusation. "I could have," he agreed, and the concession landed like a single coin in a bucket. 5 minutes, please." She almost laughed then, at the simplicity of it. She placed the manila on the table between them. Its flap was tucked and stubborn, like the distance she had kept folded inside herself. "Divorce papers," she said, because there was a small ritual to announcing a death. "I signed them this morning." He looked at the envelope, then at her, then toward the door as if weighing exits he had used too often. The jazz swelled and receded. He cupped his drink as if the glass could anchor him. "This is what you want," she said. The words were a scalpel. "You were gone when they needed us. You chose strategy over me."
The room felt suddenly too bright, as if light had been turned up to reveal all the tiny, soft defenses each had harbored. Beatriz had rehearsed this anger so many times she could feel the pattern of it in muscle and bone. It was honest anger, the kind that had been built from long, small betrayals, rather than one grand collapse. Rodrigo touched the envelope like a man who had once written love notes and now held a legal demand. He swallowed. "Tell me 5 minutes," he said, each word precise. "Just 5." Somewhere between fury and exhaustion, she chose curiosity. She had no illusions he could change the shape of 3 years with a confession, but she would listen. People could be clever at hiding their tracks. She had learned that professionally. She had taught other people how to rearrange perception. For once, she would allow herself to be surprised. "Okay," she said, 5 minutes. If an audience were present, they would have missed how the city exhaled. At a table across from them, a man speared an olive. For a moment, the two of them were small and ordinary, a couple who had decided to have a loud conversation in a room that had nothing to gain from their truth. Rodrigo reached into his coat and produced a slim stack of photographs tied with a red elastic. They were not dramatic in their content. A ledger page with columns of numbers, a receipt slightly blurred by coffee, a photograph of a hand on a parking ticket, a small photocopy of a contract stamped and annotated. His hands shook just enough to betray him. "This," he said, and laid them on the table, "is what I have been doing." Beatriz's first reflex was to dismiss bedside evidence. Evidence could be curated by anyone. She had seen enough curated realities to set a minor industry on fire. But the photographs had the tired distress of things that had been handled and rehandled. One page bore the faint signature of a man they both knew from the company boardroom, an executive whose smile had previously been a cipher for charm and cruelty. "Hume?" she said, naming names in a low voice. Saying them aloud made the world narrower, more navigable. It made blame a place to aim. He nodded. "Not everything, not yet. I couldn't go public, and I couldn't let them take you apart in court. They would have fed on it." You couldn't let us, her sentence cracked. The wound beneath her voice showed. The nights he had not come home, the way he spoke to her on the phone like she existed in a different time zone. You couldn't let us be seen. He looked at her as if calorimetry might measure the temperature of regret. I thought protecting you meant keeping the mess behind a curtain. I thought if I moved the pieces quietly, took them out one by one, whoever used your father's name as a weapon would be exposed without opening you to more harm. You thought for both of us, she finished.
He closed his eyes, and for a second she could see the calendar months passing on his face like fading ink. I thought wrong, he said, but I kept fighting. I hired people, I followed wire transfers. Beatriz, I found patterns. I found who benefited from Dr. Enrique's fall. I watched them move like vultures. There is always a point in any confession where the confessor crosses a line between explanation and absolution. Beatriz watched him measuring his words. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was offering an account. You were absent, she said. That is not a small thing. He inhaled. The jazz had shifted to a trumpet that scraped velvet. I know. I know it does not excuse what they did to your father. I know I left you to build your own life out in the open while I went underground. But I had to make them pay. Pay, she repeated, tasting the word like a chemical. And what did it cost me? What did it cost us? Silence sat between them like an extra person. Across the lounge, a waiter refilled a glass that did not belong to their table. Rodrigo slid out one of the photographs and pushed it toward her. It was an image of a crowd outside a courthouse, taken from a distance. The caption at the bottom was small, anonymous. He tapped the margin where something had been circled in pencil. This is where they wanted your father to break. That day, they tried to humiliate him publicly. They expected him to crumble on live feeds. I couldn't let that be the spectacle. Her memory collided with the photograph. Strobe lights, a camera's indifferent flash, her father standing quiet and small, palms flat against a podium, the press asking questions he could not answer because the truth of the transactions had been rearranged to look like theft. She had watched him shrink and fought first to hold him upright and then to hold herself together. The world had not been kind to those who looked cornered. You never told me any of this, she said. The words were not a question. I know. He met her eyes, and when his gaze found hers, it was not the strategic management of impression stare that executives wore in public. It was something older and less rehearsed. He reached inside his shirt, an old, nervous motion, and for a breath she felt as if she were 12 again, perched on the edge of some small rebellion under a summer sky. He tipped back his collar. There, on the left side of his chest, just above where a shirt pocket would be, a small tattoo lay hidden beneath skin and hair. Her name. Beatrice's reaction was not cinematic, it was physiological. Her chest hollowed and then filled with something she did not want to name. Ink, stealthy and intimate, carried an irreducible fact that could not be disputed. He had chosen to mark himself in a way that could not be erased by lawsuits or reputation. The tattoo was a private billboard. You have no idea how long I carried that before I could show it, he said quietly. You thought I'd fled. I was burying my moves so deep I forgot to leave a breadcrumb. She could have laughed. She could have thrown the envelope at him. Instead, the envelope trembled in her fingers like an animal sensing a threat. For the first time since she had sat down, the architecture of her anger showed a window. Why keep it hidden? She asked. Because I thought the moment to reveal it would mean trouble for you, he answered. Public knowledge would have let them use it as proof of manipulation, of our proximity. I was trying to shield you from anything that could be used to twist the narrative. I thought... He stopped. You thought for both of us, she said, and there was no forgiveness in it, only the factual calculus of two lives that had once been one. They could have ended there, the envelope between them, divorce papers signed in a small, neat script. But the universe of human decisions is rarely as clean as a contract.
Under the lounge's warm light, with rain memories smearing the windows, a different gravity pulled at them. "You had chances to tell me," she said. "There were nights I thought you chose work over me. There were nights I was alone with the thunder, and I burned letters because I didn't want to read how forgotten I'd been." He flinched at the word burned. "You burned letters?" She nodded. 23. Pages of what I wanted to say and what I never had the courage to. I burned them all. Some nights the flame felt like my only witness. Rodrigo's fingers found one of the photos and folded it slightly, as if to crease the lie away. I deserved none of that silence. The conversation was fractal. Each confession split into more questions. She thought of her mother, Mariana, small now, a woman with tremor and a litigation-shaped anxiety. She thought of her father, silent and indignant, who had never stopped being a man whose moral compass had been rearranged by a cunning few. She thought of Julia, who had kept watch over her like a sentry, legal counsel and friend in equal measure, steady and fierce. "And what about them?" she asked. "Did you make them pay?" He laid another item on the table, a printed statement, cropped and redacted, an official tone that smelled like bureaucracy and late-night printing. "There were arrests, restitution. Not everything will go public the way you might want it to. Legal things are messy. But I have been moving pieces. It took time. It cost me credit, reputation, nights where I slept 2 hours and meant none of the board meetings I attended. But I kept at it." "You didn't keep me at all," she said. The edge in her voice was sharper now, the kind of hurt that doesn't ask to be tended but demands acknowledgement. "I know." He took the drink and set it down untouched. "That is the place where I admit to failing. There will always be moments where the mind tries to translate pain into a ledger. You owe me, I owed you. People keep tabulated lists of failures and victories. But there are other currencies, those of proximity, touch, the small, unruly intimacies that paperwork will never reconcile. Beatriz thought of her own reconstruction after the scandal, the first client she booked who didn't flinch at her surname, the tiny mural of the business's new logo painted by hands that had sworn to help her stand up again. She had become practiced in taking small victories and treating them like sovereign states. She had learned to sleep with one eye open at night, not because she feared new scandals, but because the old hurt lived like a bruise, tender to the slightest pressure. Rodrigo watched her count the cost in ways he had tried to preempt and miscalculated. He was not the villain of tabloids. No one is entirely that simple. But he had put strategy above presence and paid for it in a currency his marriage did not value. She rose when the rest of the lounge fell into some other story. Her decision felt almost ceremonial, the envelope a coffin for some shared assumption. "Sign here," she said, sliding a pen from her clutch as if she were performing a necessary administrative death. Rodrigo hesitated, and then, slowly, we could see the moment he made a choice. He leaned forward and took the pen with hands that had negotiated mergers and layoffs. His signature was not a flourish. It was a small thing, a line across a name, a tidy stop at the end. When he handed the pen back, his fingers brushed hers. The contact lingered, the kind of contact that is not allowed in press photographs or in the soft world of private memory. Outside, the rain had changed to a steady drum. Inside the lounge, the jazz had thinned to notes that trembled like conversation held in a whisper. Beatriz looked at the signed papers as if looking at a map she had not expected to read. The manila, once a decision, now held within it the ghost of what had been. "Will you go?" she asked. He looked at the papers, then at her, then at the glow of the city visible beyond the lounge's glass. "I'm tempted to walk out," he said, a confession that had within it both threat and plea. "But I don't want to disappear again." There are things people say to keep the door ajar. There are other things people say to block it shut. The envelope sat between them like an unsent letter. For years she had written letters she never sent, and burned them in a kitchen sink candlelight that felt almost sacramental. Tonight the envelope was different. It was an object both of closure and of the possibility that closure could be undone. She folded herself into a choice that was less about law and more about the raw physics of human need. She had come to end a marriage that had become a ghost, but ghosts have ways of making their hosts feel alive. She could file the papers and walk away into a life carefully arranged from small victories, or she could do something reckless and human, press a palm to the place on a chest where a name remembered her. Outside the lounge, a limousine idled in the rain, black and patient. Rodrigo had arranged it, or found it, as if he had expected one of the two options she might choose. The driver's warmth fogged the windows. The back seat smelled faintly of leather and citrus. "No," he said finally, softly. "Don't sign just yet." She looked at him. It was not an answer she had expected. "Why?" "Because I have nights I have to face now," he said, "and I would like to be present for them." Presence had been the currency she had ached for. It was the small, repetitive payment of making coffee in the morning and showing up for anniversaries. It was the slow accumulation of small acts that told a person they were not alone. He could resign a title or hand over a letter of renunciation, but those things, though dramatic, were not the same as sitting in the dark and catching someone's breath right when they needed it most. She had spoken of divorce with a voice made of finality. Time had taught her that sometimes people say what they mean because they have to stop themselves from hoping. But there is a raw, reckless human response that follows the hearing of a secret, the decision to choose proximity over procedure. The limousine was a private room peopled by two citizens who had been estranged by strategy and hate in equal measure. They left the lounge and the rain drew them in, like a clean hand smoothing a wrinkled page. Inside the car, the world was muted. Rodrigo took the envelope from the table and placed it beside him, as if he had plucked the heart from a body and laid it gently on a pillow. Beatriz watched him, uncertain whether he was making an offer or performing an apology. 5 minutes, she said again, the phrase now less a prison and more an experiment. You asked for divorce, he said, and then you sat with the envelope as if it was a stone you were ready to throw. I am done with being a ghost in my own life, she said. You should know that. He looked at her, and in the mirror of his expression she read the small, complicated truth. He had been trying to save the marriage in a way that excluded the marriage itself. He had chosen a battlefield where victory would not look like their bedroom. He had been busy clearing their name in empty rooms while their shared life, the small domestic geography of love, had decayed. Inside the limo, the rain made a soft, steady percussion on the roof. He reached for her hand with a hesitancy she found almost maddening, apologetic, deliberate, like a man asking permission to cross a line he had once crossed without thought. What do you want from me? He asked. It was not merely a question about the papers. It was a question about whether the person who stood across from him was the same one who had once lain in his arms and promised a domestic eternity. She surprised herself with the honesty of her answer. I want you to be present, she said.
Not just the man who fights conspiracies in the dark and expects me to trust. I want therapy. I want proof. I want you to choose me in small ways, daily, or I want to keep the papers. And if I can't promise that overnight? He asked. You can promise to try, she said. You can promise to show up. It is strange how the simplest promises can either repair or rend. He promised. The word was not a contract, but a vow that had weight because it was not given lightly. I will show up, he said. I will do whatever work is required. She squeezed his hand in return. A small, marrow-level recognition passed between them. Promises mean almost nothing without the labor that follows. They did not go home. The limousine glided through a city washed and softened by rain. Rodrigo's apartment was quiet and private, a place of minimal lines and art that seemed curated by a man who had once believed taste could serve as meaning. When they entered, the air smelled like the lingering scent of cedar and old papers. He removed his coat, and for a moment they were children again, two people on the edge of a decision whose gravity neither fully understood. She placed the manila on the coffee table. It sat there like an accusation. It sat there like a joke. She had imagined in countless rehearsals the melodramatic throwing of the envelope across a room. Instead, she sat down on the couch and watched him as he paced the room like a man trying to draw a map of his own mistakes. You will not go back to being what you were before, she said. Not because of the paper, but because we were both damaged by it. He stopped his pacing and looked at her, the light from the window catching the tattoo at his collarbone when he turned. I know. If I asked you to take me back as if nothing had happened, I'd be asking for a miracle I didn't earn. So why are we here? She asked. Because I wanted to tell you something I couldn't in the public record, he said. Because every time I thought about asking you to trust me,
I imagined the press turning it into a story about manipulation. I thought if I exposed how I'd been trying to fix things, they'd turn it into ammunition against you. And I couldn't bear that. He moved closer, and the room shrank to the size of a breath. She felt her defenses, the ones she had built like small fortifications during 3 long years, begin to show seams. There was a tiredness in his voice that contradicted every public appearance he had ever made. Exhaustion, it seems, had a better bearing of truth than bravado. Their conversation, long and jagged, made small crescendos and quiet retreats. He spoke about nights alone in hotels following leads, about men who smiled too easily in boardrooms, about photographs he had unearthed like relics. He did not phrase his narrative as a request for absolution. He offered it as a kind of accounting.
In the bookshelf by the window, amid thick volumes of business treatises, she noticed a small stack of postcards, places she had once wanted to visit. He must have bought them on nights when he still entertained the possibility of a future they would plan. The presence of the postcards, small, domestic, ridiculous, did more to humanize him than any apology. There, in the hush of his apartment, with rain pressing at the glass and the city's hum a distant pain, something else opened, the possibility of touch. It did not arrive as a cinematic seizure. It came as a decision born of a tired desire. She stepped closer. They had always known one another's edges. The years had not undone the physics of their bodies. They had merely rearranged the consent into something more careful. She kissed him first, not the desperate, hungry kiss of a person trying to assuage loneliness, nor the photographed, ideal kiss of a romance novel. It was an insistence and a testing. He answered with the slow steadiness of a man who had learned to value presence more than proof. It was tender. It was fierce. It was a litany of things unspoken. They moved together as if language had been inadequate and the body required a different grammar. There were moments where his hands caught the back of her neck and moments where hers smoothed his hair away. There was an honesty in the quiet. Consent became visible in the way they kept asking, small verbal verifications between whispers that sounded almost sane. Are you sure? Are you comfortable? Yes. The whisper of those affirmations was the new liturgy. They undressed with the kind of slowness that convalescence requires, like two people learning how to be allowed into one another's interior lives again. The city outside blurred under the rain. The apartment condensed into a space of small gestures, removing a cuff, tucking hair behind an ear, adjusting a pillow. When they joined, it was not a consummation that erased pain. It was a mutual, fragile thing, need and apology braided together, constructed like a scaffold. At one point, in the unbuttoned intimacy between breath and silence, Rodrigo pressed his palm against the curve of her back and seemed to memorize the place where austerity became softness. She felt an ache so dense it could have been catalogued and then relieved in the same movement. That ache had nothing to do with the scandal and everything to do with absence. In the shade of that apartment, the fragile architecture of reconciliation began. Hands that kept asking permission, murmured confessions instead of grand speeches, a tattoo that reminded them both of a promise made in a different language of intimacy. There existed in their frantic reconciliation the double edge of fragility and possibility. They were not healed. They had not even begun to repair the long fissures. But for that night, the gravity between them had shifted.
They were closer than they had been in years, measured in centimeters, and in the soft tidal force of closeness itself. When at last they lay tangled and exhausted on the sheets, the city outside had quieted into a steady drizzle. Beatriz felt the envelope in her bag like an animal that had not stopped breathing. It had been meant to be a legal instrument, cold and administrative. Now it was an artifact of a life she had almost divorced. Rodrigo traced circles on her back with a fingertip, as if the movement could smooth out the past. There was a humility in his touch she had not felt in him before, a willingness to be small and flawed and present. "Tomorrow is not promised," he whispered. "No," she said, "but we have tonight." He did not ask her to sign the papers then. He did not promise the world. He only stayed. He snuffed the light with a hand that left the room shaded and quiet. Outside the window, the rain kept time on the glass. She did not sleep at once. In the dark, she thought of her father's face in a photograph he had once kept in his wallet, a man who had weathered public shame and refused to be reduced to rumor. She thought of her mother's voice when it cracked. She thought of the letters she had burned, the ash of sentences that had never been spoken, but had shaped her decisions most of all. Around 2 in the morning, the city seemed to move with a gentler caution. The apartment smells of cedar and hymn, and the faint perfume she had chosen that night, amber and smoke, and something that reminded her of winter. She remembered the tattoo again, the small defiant mark that said someone had tattooed her into his skin, like ownership or like devotion, an act that could be read as either, depending on the era of their marriage you inherited. The limousine had not been a romantic trope. It had been a reminder of the distance wealth can create between private need and public performance. In that car and in that apartment, the props rearranged. They were 2 people testing the possibility of presence. When dawn had not yet decided to break, when the city was a low rectangle of light against the sheets, Beatriz rose slowly. Her legs trembled with an unfamiliar ache, not violent, not alarming, but insistent. She steadied herself on the bedside with hands that suddenly felt foreign to her own body. "You okay?" Rodrigo asked, still half asleep on one elbow. She laughed softly, a sound that was equal parts rue and wonder. "I can't quite walk straight," she admitted. "Feels like the muscles seized." He sat up fully, concern sharpening the line of his face. "What did we—" His laugh dissolved into tenderness. He did not call it an injury. He moved carefully, fetching a bag of ice from the freezer, because that is what people who care do. They find small, practical acts to make fragility bearable.
The tenderness of making tea, of wrapping a damp towel around an ankle, of bringing back sage-scented steam from a bathroom became the first steps in an unfinished ritual of care. While he fussed, she watched him as if cataloging the quality of his attention. He did not announce grand gestures, he performed small mercies. There was, of course, the manila envelope on the coffee table, the signed papers like a small relic she had not yet buried. There was also the quiet evidence of his clandestine work placed in a stack by the bookshelf, photocopies of documents, a few printed press notices, the faint residue of meticulous labor. The room was full of artifacts of 2 kinds, those that could be used to destroy, and those that were being tentatively handed over to build something fragile. Beatriz wanted to ask the questions that had been waiting for 3 years: how exactly he had executed his investigation, whether the conspirators had been tried, whether her father's name would be fully cleared and publicly acknowledged. She wanted lists, dates, arrests, restitution. She wanted the legal certainty she had been denied. But the morning was small and human. The big answers needed time, counsel, and a public forum. The small tenderness required hands and slow movements. When Rodrigo returned, he placed a small envelope on the table beside the manila and touched her knee lightly. "I brought something," he said. She looked at it. A narrow slip of paper, not dramatic, not a resignation letter, not a press release, just a note. The simplicity of it made her suspicious for a moment. He had made complicated moves for 3 years. Why begin this morning with something so small? She opened it. Inside there were 3 words in his handwriting, crooked and earnest. "I will stay." Not a promise to be perfect, not a grand gesture, not a resignation from the life he had built. A small vow to be present, a sentence measured against the years in which he had not been. Beatriz folded the note and left it between her palms like a tiny relic. For the first time since the scandal, she could imagine the possibility of reconstruction, not as a miraculous restoration, but as a laborious rebuilding. There were still things unsaid. There were still papers to file or undo. There were still people who had lied and who would have to face whatever consequences the law and disclosure could bring. There was Julia, who had advised her not to trust empty gestures, her mother, who would need to see public restitution for the world to believe in their new truth, and her father, who would have to accept apologies that were never enough. But in the quiet light that entered the apartment, with rain still beating at the windows, Beatriz felt something like a decision take root. It was neither surrender nor victory.
It was the first choice of many, to stay and test the possibility of a new covenant built on honesty and therapy and presence, or to keep the signed papers and walk away from a man who, whether through cowardice or calculation, had cost her essential years. She could have closed the envelope on his future and gone home to the small, carefully curated life she had rebuilt. She could have pressed the legal red button that would have made their private implosion a neat public fact. Instead, she folded the note into the manila and left it on the table. Outside, the city blurred with the promise of rain. Inside, 2 people moved through small actions: tea, ice packs,
whispered confessions that had the gravity of a treaty. The morning had not yet delivered its consequences. It had not yet tested the promise of his presence against the public metrics of truth. There were calls to make, lawyers to inform, and the press, always patient, always ravenous for a seam to widen. There were also the quiet, relentless practicalities: a medical appointment for her ankle, a strategy meeting with Julia, a visit to see Dr. Enrique with restitution documents in hand. The work of rebuilding would require more than ink on a paper. It would need gestures that were consistent and daily. Beatriz looked at Rodrigo as if assessing him in a new currency, one not of reputation or power, but of time. He met her gaze, and in that look made a vow neither of them could yet fully keep. They had crossed a line tonight, from estrangement to a fragile proximity. The night had been the desperate move she had risked, a last surrender of a heart that had already been careful of itself for too long. The manila envelope remained, a hinge between two possible futures. She had not yet decided which door to close. Outside, the rain gathered on the windows, and the city moved on. Inside, two people tried to learn how to be present to one another again, and the first small acts of care began to stitch a map that might, if they were both willing, lead them somewhere new. They did not pretend the night had fixed everything. The note, 3 crooked words folded into the manila, lay between them like a small treaty. Rain still glimmered on the window, as if the city had been rinsed of something that would not be named. Beatriz kept thinking in terms of lists: what had to happen next, who needed to be told, which promises could be measured. The first person she called was Julia. The lawyer's voice on the other end was all pragmatic calm. What would Beatriz need to protect herself now that the scaffolding between them had shifted? Did she want the signed papers filed, put on hold, or left in a drawer? Julia's questions were direct, professional. She offered options that felt like small islands of control in a sea of emotion. Keep them, Julia advised after a pause. For now. If you file, you close the door. If you keep them, you preserve your choice.
And bring me everything Rodrigo has given you. Documents, photos, anything. We'll corroborate. We'll move the pieces so your father gets public clearing. But none of that undoes what you lost. That work is different. Beatriz agreed. She had not expected counsel to be tender, but Julia's steadiness had always been part legal mind, part friend, fierce, direct, unsentimental when necessary. The arrangement they sketched that morning was pragmatic: an immediate medical check for the soreness in her legs, a private meeting with Dr. Enrique to present any evidence quietly before the press rode the wave, and then, if both families agreed, a controlled release of information that would unmask the men who had built the conspiracy. When Beatriz hung up, Rodrigo was in the kitchen folding the newspaper like an apology. She watched him, cataloging the smallness of the domestic acts, folding a page, setting down a mug, taking the trash out. Presence, she had said, and now presence arrived as menial labor. It was the simplest currency. In the days that followed, the world, the public one, moved at its own appetite. There were headlines that gossiped and headlines that interrogated. There were commentators who found the story delicious in its ambiguity. Julia kept Beatriz shielded from the worst of it. She arranged private meetings at times and places the press could not access, a prosecutor's office down a quiet side street, a small room in the courthouse with coffee-stained chairs, a private investigator who sat across from them and spun the chain of evidence into a coherent narrative. Rodrigo sat sometimes in those rooms, and sometimes stayed away, depending on what was needed. He had learned a new discipline: to be present in the ways that mattered, and to be absent when his presence could complicate an investigation. The arrests came in a steady, unspectacular sweep. They were not cinematic, no dramatic cuffs under studio lights, but methodical, bureaucratic, the sort of thing that took months of subpoenas and ledgers and bank records to produce. Marcio Tavares was taken in one gray morning as he left his weekend apartment. Roberto Figueiredo found himself answering questions in a small room with fluorescent lighting. Daniela Costa's name surfaced in a series of emails that had been easier to spin before Rodrigo and his investigators started to map the money. They were charged with fraud, with conspiracy, with using Dr. Enrique's reputation as ammunition. The public statements issued by the prosecutor were careful and legalistic, but the effect on Beatriz's family was immediate and visceral, a slow public rebalancing of truth. A week after the arrests, a courier arrived at her parents' door with a packet wrapped in plain brown paper,
a formal notice from the prosecutor's office stating that an investigation had supported the allegation that Dr.
Henrique had been targeted, a letter offering the state's apology for mistakes made in the early, chaotic days of the scandal, and an informal restitution plan indicating that funds associated with the conspirators' gains would be returned where possible. It was not theater, it was legal machinery doing the work it could. Mariana read the papers aloud in the tight kitchen, tears making her voice high and thin. Dr. Henrique sat at the table, his hands steady on the pages. He did not smile like a man rescued. He looked smaller, as if some of the weight he had carried for months had shifted into a steadier place. Beatriz watched from the doorway, the sting of vindication wrapped in the ache that nothing could truly return. "They can't take back the nights," she said softly to her mother, who reached for her and squeezed until the words blurred. Rodrigo arrived with a stack of documents and the kind of awkwardness that tried too hard could look natural. He set the files on the table and waited. In the living room, Dr. Henrique folded and refolded the prosecutor's note as if it were a map whose coordinates he needed to memorize. He did not rush to forgive in performative ways. He listened to Rodrigo explain the pieces, what had been collected, why some things had been held private, what restitution could do and what it could not. "You did this quietly," Dr. Henrique said finally, his voice low. The old authority in him was tempered by fatigue. "You ought to have told me you were doing it." Rodrigo looked down. "I thought it was the only way to prevent them from using you more." "And at what cost?" Beatriz asked. "It cost everything I failed to protect," he said. He had yearned to be blunt in small moments like this. "It cost the nights I didn't come home. It cost the trust I should have been paying like interest." Forgiveness was not an item to check off. The family's reconciliation was a slow palette of small conversations. Dr. Henrique and Rodrigo walking through ledger entries, while Beatriz and Mariana listened. Julia explaining how restitution would work and what it might look like when public statements followed. Beatriz insisted on being present in those procedural moments. She wanted to know the precise wording of statements, the sequence of press releases, the timeline for any public clearing. She did not want surprises. She had learned the vocabulary of caution. There were private calls Rodrigo made that Beatriz never overheard, to board members, to the company's legal counsel, to people whose names had once perched like varnish on the edges of his life. He was not blameless in the court of public opinion. Quiet complicity had its costs, but he was generous with evidence now, handing over the traces he had collected that implicated the conspirators. It was not a clean trade. Some conspiracy threads led to other rooms. Some names meant more complicated entanglements. But the arrests stood.
Restitution funds were identified, accounts frozen, and, quietly, money began to move in ways that suggested accountability. Rodrigo's next move was perhaps the hardest, a document he slid across a conference table to the board of his company. He had prepared for months, not for the drama of being judged by shareholders, extricate itself from the fallout without the distraction of a headline about his marriage. He proposed a transitional leadership plan that would keep the company stable while repairing its reputation. The board's response was mixed. Some called it noble, some called it costly, some called it performative. But they accepted the letter as the first of many steps Rodrigo would take to make his private choices align with public responsibility. For Beatriz, that letter was one of the few tangible tokens he could offer her authority over. It was not a magical undoing. A resignation would not heal what had been lost. But it meant he was willing to let go of one axis of power in his life to practice presence on another. She read the letter at her kitchen table with Julia across from her. They were both precise in their reading. Julia, ever the lawyer, flagged the language she would prefer to make public, phrasing that would emphasize taking responsibility without suggesting the company was in default. "You can ask him to make it public," Julia said, which was both advice and test. Beatriz closed the document and placed it in the manila envelope. It was a small ritual of custody. "I want therapy," Beatriz said then, plain as a ledger entry. "I want him to go to therapy. I want weekly sessions for us. I want check-ins. I want him to understand this is not a PR apprenticeship. It's a life." Rodrigo met her eyes with a plainness that felt like effort. "I'll go," he said. "I'll start tomorrow if they'll see me. I'll make time. I'll not hide in meetings. I'll do the work." Julia drew up a list of conditions that evening, not a legal contract, but a behavioral compact they could present to their families and, if necessary, to the press as a demonstration of intent.
It read like a to-do list for a relationship that had been court-martialed by absence. Therapy twice a week to start, alternating family dinners with Dr. Enrique and Mariana every 2 weeks, weekly reports to a mediator for 3 months to begin, and the retention of the divorce papers as Beatrice's right should she choose to use them. It won't stop him from making mistakes, Julia warned, but it will create a framework where his promises aren't just promises. Beatrice signed the compact with a pen that smudged ink because her hand trembled just slightly. Rodrigo signed across from her with a neat hand that had signed corporate letters for years. The signatures were not vows in the mystical sense.
They were agreements to labor. The first weeks were hard in ordinary ways. Presents looked like waking up and sitting to eat breakfast, like answering messages that had sat unread for days, like being in the same room for an hour without the television filling the silence. There were nights when Rodrigo wanted to fix everything with grand gestures, donations to restitution funds, offers to bring the most aggressive of the conspirators to justice with media campaigns, and Beatriz would stop him with a small, tremulous, "No, not now." One night, after a therapy session that left both raw, Rodrigo drove to her parents' house with a folder and a quiet hope. He did not go to present himself as a hero. He went to apologize. He went to explain in human terms what his strategy had been, to accept that what he had tried to protect had instead been a blank where conversation should have been. In the kitchen, with the light soft and that peculiar smell of overnight rice in the air, he sat and listened as Dr. Enrique told him how the scandal had felt as a man whose life's work had been called into question. "I never wanted to see you as the enemy," Enrique said quietly, more to the empty room than to Rodrigo. "I wanted to believe you loved my daughter, but love is not a contract you can arbitrate with a balance sheet." Rodrigo's answer was not eloquent. It was thin in the way raw apologies can be. "I thought protecting you meant shielding you from the public humiliation. I was wrong about the way silence would hurt you." "What matters now," Mariana said, voice tight, "is what you do from here." He took that line like a map and began to travel, presence like a new profession. He attended therapy with a humility that sometimes looked like shame and sometimes like gratitude. He learned to ask questions about memory that did not demand answers, to be present at an office opening of one of Beatrice's clients where he stood silent at the back and clapped when she spoke. He learned to bring tea without expecting praise. Beatrice in turn kept the manila envelope on a shelf where she could look at it and not touch it. It was a talisman and a weapon at once. She spoke with Julia weekly, adjusting the compact as life reshaped itself. Some days were easy. Laughter over a small, ridiculous domestic dispute about toast. The way Rodrigo learned to make coffee just as she liked it. Some days were harsh. An unflattering piece in a magazine that suggested their reconciliation was a PR stunt. A reminder in her inbox of clients who still hesitated at her surname. Trust did not arrive as a gift. It crept in increments. There was a day that became a minor legend between them. A visit to the prosecutor that concluded with a small public document acknowledging Dr. Enrique's partial exoneration. The statement was not a dramatic press conference. It was a carefully worded document that the press could not ignore.
It named the individuals involved in the conspiracy and spelled out the restitution plan. The piece that many people remembered was not a headline, but a photograph of Dr. Enrique on the courthouse steps, his expression not triumphant, but relieved, an emotion that suited him better than outrage. The public clearing, slow and legalistic, gave Beatrice's family something they had been denied for years, an auditable record that the narrative that had been used against them was false. Restitution checks arrived in accounts distributed by the court. A small private fund was set aside for damages. The conspirators' bonds were sequenced through the judicial system. It was possible to say, with some accuracy, that justice had been served within the limits of a system that rarely offered perfect closure. Yet the world of their marriage was not fixed by legal papers. There were small betrayals that still needed tending. Beatriz would sometimes find herself startled by a quiet anger that flared when Rodrigo missed a call, or when a board meeting ate his evening. "You promised to be present," she would say, and he would come to the couch with a tired look and the softness of someone learning humility. "I'm here," he would reply, and he would show up, listening, learning, repeating the small acts of care that had once been absent. The compact they had signed became an odd artifact. Once, in a cramped mediation room off a courthouse hallway, Julia held it up like a piece of evidence that something private could be treated with the seriousness of a legal paper. "This is not legal," she said, but she was smiling. "It's emotional law. It will not stand in court, but it will stand in your life if you let it." Their therapist, an unglamorous man with soft hands and a practice in the city's quieter neighborhood,
gave them homework that sounded at first silly, shared mornings when no phones were allowed, a journal each to be read aloud once a month, a contract for small gestures. The therapy sessions were at times ugly and at times luminous. They argued about the past with a relentlessness that sometimes felt like excavation. They learned to pause before accusing, to name feelings without cataloging guilt, to practice curiosity as a habit rather than a weapon. There was a moment, 3 months in, that tested their pact. A leaked audio clip of a late-night boardroom conversation, recorded illegally, cropped and offered to a tabloid, hinted at corporate maneuvering around the time of the scandal. Beatriz saw the headline and felt the old heat. Shame, rage, the sensation of being watched. She could have retreated into the fortress she had built for herself. Instead, she called Rodrigo and Julia, sat down with them, and demanded transparency. Rodrigo opened his file. Julia cross-referenced. They found the source of the clip, a disgruntled associate who had been part of the shadow network, and who now wanted leverage.
The leak became a new thread, unraveled and stitched back into place by legal motions and testimony. The temptation to feel betrayed again was strong. The work of addressing it, publicly and privately, was stronger. "It will never stop," Beatriz said once, late at night when her leg no longer ached, but the residue of pain lingered in her memory like a film. "People will always prefer spectacle." "They do," Rodrigo said, "but we prefer something else now." He said it quietly, with a weary conviction that had none of the theatricalism of his old speeches. Progress accumulated like small savings. Rodrigo relinquished the CEO role officially 6 months after the night in the limousine, stepping down to a non-executive chair position for an interim period, chosen not because it destroyed him, but because it was a practical means to remove the distraction of headlines from the company's management. The board appointed a capable external CEO who would steward the firm through reputational repair. It was a move that cost him in market confidence for a while, but gained him a certain moral breathing room. He made a public statement that did not mention his marriage. It referenced the company's difficulties and his personal decision to focus on family and morale. Beatriz watched the statement like a litmus test and found, to her surprise, that it did not make her feel anything like debt or ownership. It felt simply like a piece of business. The real currency of repair was smaller and uglier and more human. Rodrigo learned the choreography of being present. He sent messages during the day that did not contain just reports, but little observations, photographs of a cup of coffee he had thought she would have liked, reminders that he would be home for dinner. He attended family lunches and sat politely while Mariana spoke of the months of fear. He called Dr. Enrique not to negotiate outcomes, but to ask how he was and whether he needed help with anything. Dr. Enrique, slow to trust, accepted small acts with caution and then, in time, a guarded warmth. There were setbacks. A client lost trust. A colleague said something cruel at a memorial event. A journalist wrote a piece that made the city laugh at them both. Each time, the compact they had made acted as a modest point of reference. They would reconvene with Julia or their therapist and reevaluate. This was not a script for a fairy tale. It was an instruction manual for people who had decided to be stubborn enough to rebuild. One afternoon, nearly a year after the storm broke, Beatriz received a letter from a small community foundation. The organization had tracked the ripple effect of the scandal on local businesses and requested that Dr. Enrique's name be considered for a public reinstatement at the city's health advisory panel. The request was modest but meaningful. Beatriz took the letter to Rodrigo.
He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, the same man who months before had hidden a tattoo with her name underneath his shirt. "Then we'll support it," he said. They organized a modest event, a quiet press release, a short statement by the prosecutor formalizing the case against the conspirators, and a private meeting where Dr. Enrique received the court's public affirmation. The cameras caught a small, unperformative moment, Rodrigo standing a respectful distance away as Beatriz's father accepted a plate of flowers from a friend. There was no triumphalism. There was a hush in the way the city watched this repair happen, less appetite for the spectacle than before. 2 years after the night with the manila envelope, they planned a wedding in Gramado. The decision was not sudden. It had arrived like a thought pressed into the margins after years of work. They did not advertise it. It was not a rescue of their marriage, nor a coronation of a healed couple. It was a recognition that, having chosen to try and having done the labor, they wanted to commit to a new form of life with eyes open. Gramado was dew-soft in the morning. The town's stone streets glowed under a sky that did not threaten rain but promised gentle light. The ceremony was in a small chapel, framed by pines and the hush of visitors who had come quietly. Mariana wore a scarf she had not had the courage to wear for months. Dr. Enrique walked with a steadiness that made Beatriz see him as she had before the scandal, principled and stubborn and alive. Julia sat in the front row with a face that held something like pride, a friend who had survived the work of law and love. Beatriz chose a dress that was elegant without armor,
Rodrigo, who still bore the tattoo tucked discreetly beneath his shirt, wore a suit that fit like an apology fitted to a promise. The ceremony was not theatrical. The vows were not poetic flights. They were honest, measured, and small in a way that made them heavy with meaning. When Rodrigo spoke, his voice did not reach for drama. He said, "I will continue to choose presence over strategy. I will go to therapy, and I will show up for you, not because you asked, but because I know it is what you need. I will not make promises I cannot keep, but I will keep the ones I make." Beatrice's vow was quieter, a calibration of desire and caution. "I promise to keep the choice to leave as my right," she told him. "I promise to ask for what I need and to say when I am hurt. I promise to try, not to let the past be a tutor that only punishes. I will keep the papers as the gravity of my freedom and choose you daily if you show me you are worth it." There was no scene of cinematic reconciliation, no dramatic flourish where the past burned away. Instead, guests later remembered a long pause during which both of them looked at each other like people who had been tested.
The officiant, a friend they had chosen for his lack of poetry and abundance of clear-eyed wisdom, said simply, "This union is not a return to innocence. It is a decision made by people who know what it takes to be together." After the ceremony, in the chapel courtyard, where the pines smelled like summer and the sky had the mildness of a promise, Rodrigo and Beatriz walked together hand in hand. It was not the easy, untested hand-holding of young lovers. It was careful and practiced, fingers interlaced like two people who had learned to be dependable. The reception was small, family, close friends, people who had been part of the work of repair. They danced slowly to a song that was oddly intimate, a jazz standard whose notes made the air smell like lemon wax and cedar, the same sense as the lounge where everything had restarted. At dusk, they stepped out into the cool of Gramado Street. Beatriz thought of the manila envelope tucked away in a drawer at their apartment, a relic she had not yet burned or filed. She had kept the paper not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that some doors can be closed and reopened. She had kept her right to choose. The choice had been exercised not as a dramatic renunciation of independence, but as an ongoing practice of consent. The conspirators served their sentences or entered into plea arrangements. Restitution money returned to accounts where it could be used to repair some of the damage. The news cycle shifted as they always did. Scandals are cyclical by design. For Rodrigo and Beatriz, the public noise became background static they learned to work around. The real work, the domestic labor of returning to each other, continued. Therapy became less frequent. The compact evolved. They learned to argue well, to stop before recrimination hardened into blame, and to apologize without calculations. One evening, 2 years and 3 months later, Beatriz found a small charred scrap in a box they had both packed for moving. It was a fragment of one of the 23 letters she had burned years before, a sentence that had been partial and unfinished, a jagged confession she had never had the courage to deliver. She could have buried it, she thought. She could have left it as ash and regret. Instead, she set it on the mantel and read it aloud to Rodrigo, who listened and did not try to fix what was not his to fix. They had not been saved by one night of reckless surrender. They had been repaired, incrementally, by 1,000 small corded acts, reappearance instead of strategy, apology that turned to action, therapy that turned into habit. The tattoo remained hidden most days, a private witness. Sometimes when they caught each other's eyes across a room, a small private smile would appear, a remnant of the night that had been the desperate move, the human undoing that allowed them to see each other again.
On the last page of the wedding program, a tiny thing printed on heavy stock, Beatrice wrote a line in her own hand later that night before she folded the programs into a drawer. "Second chances are not rewards, they are work." When you started this story, you might have expected the envelope to close a chapter and send Beatrice walking alone into a new life. Instead, after asking for a divorce and making a last, desperate move, she found a different kind of outcome. Not the erasure of what had happened, but the beginnings of a repair that required both confession and labor. She kept her choice, and she and Rodrigo rebuilt from there, imperfectly, deliberately, and with the hard honesty that lasting things require. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Do you believe someone can truly earn a second chance? Where are you watching from? And if you want more true feel dramas about fragile people making brave choices, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.